This is the Dreadful Podcast on TV Podcast Industries, and we're here talking about Lovecraft Country, Season 1, Episode 1, Sundown.
Stories are like people. Love them doesn't make them perfect. You just try and cherish them, overlook their flaws.
Yeah, but the flaws are still there.
Yeah, they are. But I love Pope stories. I love that the heroes get to go on adventures in other worlds, to fight insurmountable odds, defeat the monster, save the day. Little Negro boys from the south side of Chicago, the only tourists that get to do that.
Unless they join the army.
Didn't join for adventure.
Welcome back, fellow Dreadfuls. This is the Dreadful Podcast from TV Podcast Industries, and we're here discussing Lovecraft Country, Season 1, Episode 1, Sundown. I am one of your Dreadful hosts, John.
I'm one of your hosts, Derek. And yeah, we've decided to turn the Dreadful Podcast into our horror podcast. We watched the first episode of Lovecraft Country and couldn't not podcast about this show.
Absolutely not. It was, I don't know if you got the same vibes as us, but this was a really lovely episode, with so many different layers. And dare I say it, that you could see the love in the craft of this episode. So we're really excited to talk about Lovecraft Country.
It really did feel like something special, didn't it? Something brand new that we haven't seen in quite a long time. You know, horror TV shows, you know, there's lots of them with things like Walking Dead and that kind of stuff out there, but this felt really special in the lead up to it. You know, it was all being advertised around J.J. Abrams' involvement and Jordan Peele's involvement. You know, we've loved Jordan Peele's movies that he's done, the horror movies that he's done over the last couple of years.
Definitely. Us, Get Out, really like phenomenal stuff, for sure.
Piques the interest when you hear the involvement of them, but they are just on as producers on the show, so still had that little trepidation about what's going to be presented. But once we saw this episode, we just had to get out the microphones and record, right?
Get in the podcast booth and podcast away to our fellow listeners, for sure. And again, a really sort of literary kind of episode at least, and maybe the season. Just thinking back to our previous stuff that we've done with Penny Dreadful, seasons 1 through to 3, you know, all based on literary characters, which just kind of added this richness of thought and I suppose meaning behind certain things. And I think here I love the description of Courtney B. Vance's character George Freeman, who's Atticus's uncle, who's warm, funny, and well read. You know, he certainly brings that literary element to it, along with Atticus as well, and it just adds new layers of meaning to those books, the people behind them, as much as to the story and what the story is trying to say. So yeah, really, really interesting stuff. So we're here to give our spoiler-filled discussion of episode 1 of Lovecraft Country. And of course, if you're new to TV Podcast Industries and if you're new to Dreadful Podcast, you can pop on over to our website at tvpodcastindustries.com. You can subscribe there on any good or evil podcast catcher of your choice. We're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, we're on Google Podcasts. You name it, pick a podcast, search TV Podcast Industries or the Dreadful Podcast, and you'll be able to find us there. And please subscribe, leave a review if you want to, or rate us. Sharing the love is, of course, sharing the podcast.
Absolutely. And we'd also love to hear from you as the season goes on. Email us to feedback at TV Podcast Industries with any thoughts you have on these episodes of this first season of Lovecraft Country.
Yeah, I think with that, we should boldly go into Lovecraft Country with torches, guns, and a fair amount of fear with us and trepidation for sure. So yeah, Derek, what are some of the details for episode 1?
Well, the show's based on the novel Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff. This episode was directed by Yann Demange. We will recognize this guy. He's a French director who directed the horror comedy Dead Set from Charlie Brooker, John. One of our absolute
great stuff.
Go-to horror comedies. It's kind of up there for me. I know it's a TV show and a lower budget, but up there for me with Shaun of the Dead.
Definitely.
Definitely. Concept translated very well.
Yeah, really good. If you've seen Big Brother and if you've seen zombie movies and you combine the two, then you get Dead Set. Really good. From Charlie Brooker, also well known for Black Mirror, but certainly it's an interesting take on the reality TV show for sure. And actually, they have one of my favorite takedowns of a zombie ever in that, which is using a duvet to cover them so that they don't bite you and stabbing them or at least killing them off in some way. I can't remember how now, through the duvet cover. Yes, so yes, cool. A great idea. I liked it.
So the memories of this will get you out of the zombie apocalypse next time. But yeah, good to see Yann Demange back in the horror genre, I suppose. Very different, not as comedic in this show, but you can tell that he has some horror chops in there. And I think that's one of the things that we always took from Dead Set, was that it is actually genuinely a horror and a comedy put together that did a really good job of doing both. Charlie Brooker obviously also known for Black Mirror, so he's got those chops as well. But he's not involved in that. The teleplay for this episode is written by the showrunner, Misha Green. She also created the show Underground, which is about the Underground Railway around the time of the Civil War. Also starring Jurnee Smollett, who plays Letitia here in this show. So obviously the two of them have worked together in the past. Great to see the two of them working together again. It sounds like a really interesting show. I definitely have to check it out. I don't think
it really does actually. Yeah.
John, do you want to tell us what Misha Green gave us with your summary for the first episode of Lovecraft Country?
Sure. Korean War veteran Atticus Freeman embarks on a journey in search of his missing father, Montrose. After recruiting his uncle George and childhood friend Letitia to join him, the trio sets out for Ardham, Massachusetts, where they think Montrose may have gone. They certainly do end up on a journey, and one that is filled with horror from start to finish. Both the monster kind and the reality of everyday life in the 1950s, I suppose, as well. But lots of intrigue here in terms of the lady in the silver, I think it's a Bentley, or like at least a big sort of car, like a Rolls Royce. Intrigue there with that, and presumably her brother at the house right at the end.
Maybe, or butler.
Or butler, which says, to Mr. Freeman, as Atticus has rang the bell, a welcome home. So, we've been expecting you, lots of intrigue in this. And indeed the intrigue around, Atticus's missing father, Montrose, who has gone off to Ardham County in Massachusetts.
Well, I do love the joke in there that effectively that's what Atticus thinks, because all of the books are based around Arkham, or the Arkham Press that publishes all of the books. So he thinks it's Arkham that they're going to, but it's not Arkham at all. It's actually Ardham, because he can't read his father's writing.
Yes.
Which is really good. But yeah, it's so intriguing. And my first compliment, I suppose, that I'll give the show is, it's an awful experience for the characters that are going through these, but I kind of like how it's treated as the day-to-day life of a Black American in the 50s. The kind of things that they would be putting up with are unsurprising to them in a way. We kind of hear about what his uncle does for a living. What Uncle George does is that he writes this book, which is the Traveler's Guide to safe travel across America, effectively. So he's done these kind of travels by car across America, experiencing the situations that they're going to experiencing on the road. But I kind of almost like that it's not treated as incident after incident to shock the audience. It's treated as these are the genuine experiences that these characters would be kind of almost used to at the time. And they know the tells to get themselves out of those situations as quickly as they can. Atticus is constantly called the smart guy because he's constantly trying to get himself out of awful situations that he has in there. And I love how it's treated on the show. I think it's one of the big selling points for this show.
Most definitely. We normally joined by our friend and fellow podcaster, Chris, over on TV Podcast Industries.
But we did this so quick because we were so excited about the episode. I don't think we even told them that we're recording this.
No, we haven't. But if you want to hear us, you can go over to our main feed, TV Podcast Industries, where we've just looked at The Umbrella Academy Season 2. We have also just looked at Penny Dreadful City of Angels as well on Dreadful Podcast. And we are about to also look at the start of September at The Boys Season 2 as well. So please head on over and join us for those as well. We'd really like to hear your thoughts on any of those shows as well.
But of course, we are jumping in with another little squeezing in a TV show for the next 10 weeks that'll be out every week over on Sky Atlantic and on HBO, and it's this one, Lovecraft Country, because we just had to. But John, I think we're going to keep it a little bit looser on having top 3 or top 5 points or anything like that. We're just going to talk about the things we liked about the episode, really. What's kind of the first thing that jumped to mind for yourself?
So to your point, it is kind of, we've introduced this as a horror show, in a sense. It's obviously more than that, and I think that is within the horror itself. So my main point is, just the overall umbrella horror of this first episode, from the racism that is directed towards and experienced by Atticus, George, and Letitia, effectively on their road trip to find his father, Montrose. But also then, set against and with that traditional horror action that we see in the woods. It's that cabin in the woods at night, sort of doing the barricades and surviving till the daytime. And it's just a really, really nice blend. I don't know who said it. I really can't remember where the quote came from or whether I'm just making this up, to be honest. But I do have a feeling that it's from Jordan Peele on the many interviews that he's done that talked about why there hadn't been more Black horror writers, directors, because the experience of Black people in many countries and in different forms and ways of life have experienced horror on a daily basis. I suppose that idea, like we see here, of effectively being chased out of a town where they had stopped simply to get food at the diner, and chased out no less by people in the fire brigade and the police, chasing them down, firing at them. And as you say, the smarts of Atticus, where him and George have that conversation about why were the walls painted white on the White House, talking about the British sort of burning of the White House, and then them being painted by slaves white to hide the burns. And that tradition, because all the walls in this diner are white, and they move one of the floor plates to see burnt rafters underneath. And all the while, Letitia is hearing the person who's just served them kind of saying, like, I don't want to serve them. What do I do?
Well, he didn't even serve them. He just gave them a menu at a far distance. And I think what's even scarier about the scene, if you match it up, this is George who's provided the safe travel guide for Black people to travel safely across America. He's going to a place where he's marked in his book, this is somewhere safe to eat. And when they get in there, they find out the place has been burnt out, taken over by people that are going to kill them. Like that in itself is like the premise of a horror movie. Going to a place you think you're safe and having other people that are willing to kill you take it over.
Exactly. It's the layers of the fact that this probably was a Black business or Black owned business at some time that was taken down through arson from it being burnt out. And it then new owners have come in, and that's what they're covering up with all of this. And, effectively run out of town. And this is kind of where we first see, the silver limo that is mentioned by, the owner of a bar back in Chicago that, Atticus's father has gone to drink, that this person came to pick them up with all this intrigue around why he's going off to Ardham County in Massachusetts. So kind of saves the day. And actually, when you look at that particular moment where that Letitia is driving, she's outrunning the the car behind that's firing on them, and at the intersection gets in front of this silver limo that's driving down, and this limo goes between the two cars. But ultimately it swerves, and the car that's chasing them down doesn't hit the limo. Whether it was, I presume there's something supernatural about the driver or even about the car, but the car with the police and the firemen shooting at Atticus, George and Letitia, it doesn't hit the silver limo. It just kind of, it's almost like it hits a force field around it and flips. Yes. But we get this very well dressed lady stepping out of the car. And that's kind of it. They kind of drive, you know, so it's definitely that moment. But I mean, after kind of a short respite with, I think it's Letitia's brother, you know, they're kind of subjected to even more horror with this, quite frankly, horrific concept of sundown, and sundown towns, and sundown, in this case, counties. I think it was the Devon County. And it's just kind of really frightening. Like, police, fire brigades, kind of slogans of protect and serve, or you think here in Ireland that policing by consent. You know, obviously here, there's no, the police do not carry guns in that sense. In Ireland, you know, it's only special sort of divisions of the police department that would be trained to handle those weapons and discharge them under particular circumstances. So having this notion that even the police are sort of almost implementing this sundown as well, where if you're not out of a town, and in this case the county, by sundown, then effectively you will get lynched or murdered, is quite frankly the basis of horror stories in itself. Absolutely. I mean, you kind of think of the classic horror movies of, you know, whether it's like Wicker Man, going into towns where people have their own kind of ways that are absolutely abnormal to the rest of society, except this was something that was kind of openly normal, even if it was illegal. And it kind of brings that idea of things like the Wicker Man to mind here.
Yeah, I had to look it up because it is something that's kind of alien, being from Ireland and not living in the US. I have lived there before, lived in Carolina, so I'm aware of how racist some areas of the US have been and still are at times. But the concept of a sundown town was something that I wasn't fully aware of. I have something in the back of my mind about the simple thing of a sign in a town that says get out of here or else bad things will happen to you at night, effectively a warning to black people not to go into the town. But sundown towns were actually much more pervasive than that. There was much more about it. The sundown town concept effectively is that they won't allow anybody of any different race at all settle in the town. Laws will be made so they can't purchase any land there or own any business within the town limits. And then they extended, as you see in this episode, just by that line of dialogue, they extended to counties, all banding together to say that anybody of any different race couldn't live within those bounds. So it isn't just the threat of, you know, you can drive through here during the day, but if you're caught here during sundown, some bad things will happen to you. You know, it's much worse than that. It is institutionalized within this kind of city limits and these town limits. Like
communities, Exactly. I mean, it's real kind of that sense of head of the valleys where it's a single family just interbreeding for eternity.
Exactly. And I suppose but I suppose the thing that's even scarier is that these places still exist in some segments of society in the US, and some smaller counties, some smaller towns. These are still practices that are there, despite laws being in place across the US that nobody can be discriminated against on purchasing a house by their color or race or creed, effectively. So these things do still exist. These things are still as horrific today as they were back then, but just more worn on the arm, I suppose, back in the 50s than they were now, you know. I love that moment where we have George and Atticus talking in the diner waiting for everything that's going on, and George is saying to Atticus, you're a veteran, you're somebody that people should respect here. You don't have to be scared in this town. People will respect you.
We're citizens.
Because you were fighting for the freedom of this country, they'll respect you. And Atticus realizes that's not what this town is about. This town is about making sure that anybody of any different race than the people in this town will be attacked. And he sees that instantly, like that all three of these characters kind of have their own knowledge about the tells, as I said earlier on, about what could happen to them.
Yeah, there's real street smart there. But I think that horror of day-to-day life, living under that kind of horrific system, and the horror that presents to try and live your daily life, I thought was really, really well done here. And I think, set against that traditional horror then right at the end, where, they're being taken into the woods to effectively to be shot. And then you hear the chirping and churring of this unknown monster, and you get this whole like traditional horror kind of action, really, where they are being picked off in the woods, the sheriffs that are with this kind of head of the police from Devon County, who's a real nasty piece of work, proper just obnoxious and horrible.
Like his one line that really just struck fear into my heart was where Atticus asks him about taking a U-turn. He stops and says, can I take a U-turn here, or is that against the law? And he goes, oh, well, I'm glad you asked me. Now that you said it, I'll make an exception. But if you stay here after sundown, it will be my duty to string you up and lynch you effectively. Like this is a horrific person. He gets everything that's coming to him. There's such great wish fulfillment as you watch this episode. There's moments in this episode where you just want to punch the people on the screen for the lines they're saying. And that moment where you see what happens to him above all of the rest of the officers, all taken out and all killed. But the gruesomeness of what happens to him it's such great hero fulfillment, I suppose.
Well, that's it. And I mean, the traditional horror element here is that idea of being picked off in the woods. It almost feels very much Predator-esque in that sense.
It's getting some Attack the Block vibes as well.
Exactly. You have them going to the cabin in the woods to kind of hunker down, to kind of try and survive till the daytime. And again, even just that element of traditional horror, you have George sort of recounting a verse from Bram Stoker's Dracula about the children of the night singing as these creatures are kind of communicating to one another.
Dreadful vibes, right?
What happened? You see that the head of the police has been bitten, but has survived. As I think the three of his men have been taken out, and you get this coughing as he starts to transform, and you kind of have. I love George's comment here with the other sheriff. Then he goes, "You need to shoot him now," because it's what happens if you get bitten by a vampire and you don't die. You transform, and you get this transformation of this obnoxious chief of police for Devon County into this an actual monster. Sort of that realization of almost who he actually is. Now, he does escape, and I'm just wondering what will happen there, whether we'll see him again in that form, because one of the interesting things about it is that Letitia, she can run. She's told to go and get the car, because what they've realized is that, like vampires, the torchlight that they have seems to fend them off. And she is told, well, it's Atticus who is going to go, but then again, this chief of police says, no, the girl, you'll get smart and you'll try and escape. I love that scene of her running. Like, she does it so well, because she's running so hard, you can really feel it. But at the same time, she's kind of like whimpering and screaming, because it's just like, this is so frightening to be in this position.
Fear won't help us, John. And
it's just so nicely done. And I think that ultimately she saves Atticus and George from the chief of the transformed chief of police, and they chuck out the flares. But one of the interesting things, and it's kind of why I think will we see him again, is just because there's kind of a high-pitched whistle that goes through the forest. It's almost like a dog whistle calling off the pack.
Absolutely.
And that's really interesting, because I think, is it to do with the lady in the silver sedan? Is it to do with these people that we don't know about yet? And their part in this story. So it's a really nice sort of intrigue here. And I think the mix of horror in this episode is just really so well done.
Definitely. Because Letitia and Atticus were under attack from these creatures. I think they're Shoggoths, depending on your pronunciation. Atticus mentions these creatures as protectors or as minions, I suppose, of Cthulhu from H.P. Lovecraft stories. He mentions them a few times earlier on. He doesn't specifically call out that that's what they are, I think. When they come on screen, because they're running in the screening, they don't get a moment to stop and say the name of the creatures. But I was wondering, there's that moment where you're wondering whether they are the protectors of Atticus, George, and Letitia, and that's why they're called off. Maybe is that what it is? But they were definitely under attack at moments within this scene in the woods, weren't they? So there's no.
Well, it is, and if they are protectors, it might explain why George it survives coming through. I know, even though he's rationalizing that it's the torch because that's all he got through to the cabin with. Yeah. We see Letitia turn on the headlights of the car, which seems to frighten away one of these creatures to burrow down into the ground. Cool. But maybe, and she is attacked again and she uses the flashlight. So there is that. So, but it could also be a protector, but maybe they're just not quite as disciplined protectors as, say, a very well-trained dog, for example. It could be that they still need that sort of dog whistle control to be able to sort of stop them from attacking the people they're supposed to protecting. But nonetheless, I thought this was really so well done in this episode. It felt so rich with everything within the horror genre. The other thing to draw from this for me was, and it's the opening quote from the first episode, is that chat between Atticus and the lady who was traveling with him. Was just really, really good. I think it's. It's that chat about the book that Atticus is reading on the coach back to Chicago, to find out, maybe more about where his missing father Montrose is. And, it was just, I think it's played really, really nicely. The book is Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And within that is actually the first, reference to John Carter of Mars. And, I am a huge fan of John Carter of Mars, and I'm a big fan of the movie. However awful people may have thought that was.
I think it just came out as a bad time. They always say that John Carter inspired so many other things and they got the credit, but John Carter was around in like the 1900s and earlier.
But it's just so good, and it was just interesting, Atticus starts to explain to her as effectively they've been abandoned on the side of the road because the coach has broken down, and the person who's got the truck, who's come to sort of give them the lift into town to the next stop to pick up the next coach, won't allow blacks onto his truck. So
just from that opening setup moment, that you see it with Atticus leaving town and just sticking up a finger to another bridge named after a slave owner, as the fellow traveler describes it. But the two of them, again, you see him looking at this driver going, well, he's not going to let black people on board. We're only just relegated to the last 4 seats on a bus. This guy's not going to allow us to sit in the back of his truck. And he just walks over and says to his fellow traveler, I'll carry your bags for you. And both of them seem completely used to this. It feels like this is something that they wouldn't be protesting in a way. They wouldn't be protesting about because they're so used to this kind of crap happening at the time, I suppose. It's another indication of how we're going with the show, I suppose.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, but I loved how Atticus is explaining to her as they're walking down the country road. It was a captain in the Confederate Army from Virginia who was chased by Apaches into one of their ceremonial caves, where then he's transported to the Red Planet. I always remember being transfixed reading these Pulp Fiction, effectively, with that way of doing it. First of all, I was really intrigued by the indigenous Americans and First Peoples. I thought that was just, I've always been interested about their culture in America and Canada. The idea then that was kind of that almost spiritual connection that they have to another planet, and the forces that were on that red planet on Mars. And she's kind of like, so hang on, he fought for slavery, and Atticus is, well, he's an ex-Confederate captain. And she goes, X doesn't change anything here, doesn't change that. And then Atticus has I just think it's a really nice point of, stories are like people. Loving them doesn't make them perfect. You just try and cherish them and overlook their flaws. And she goes, their flaws are still there. And he's kind of, yes, they are, but I love pulp stories, which is kind of what this is about. And I think one of the interesting things from this is that H.P. Lovecraft, other authors have dubious backgrounds as to where their ideological or moral or ethical core is.
And H.P. Lovecraft is a straight up racist.
No, exactly.
Yeah,
and
I love the idea that you can take bits of what he put into the world and go, these are great bits. It doesn't have to just define everything in a way.
Well, and I think it's it's almost the philosophy of Atticus, which is that these heroes that he's reading about in a book written by a white guy are not perfect, probably don't necessarily speak exactly to who he is, but that he puts himself in that adventure, in their place. So he becomes John Carter. And so by becoming John Carter, he is no longer as such an ex-Confederate soldier who fought for slavery. Yeah. He's a black guy saving the princess of Mars. And I mean, to that point, that opening sequence is just, I mean, my sci-fi fantasy horror sort of love just kind of slightly melted there. Loved it. With everything going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk about that in just a second as well. Because it is, I suppose, this moment, I just want to highlight it as well, just as you have. This is one of the things that I feel is so important as a statement of the show, So many times over the decades and centuries, books have not had the representation that anybody from any minority has wanted them to have. We don't see our faces reflected in the stories that are being consumed by the mass media, by mass market. And sometimes you'll see a lot of minorities shoved into one story because somebody's finally been given a platform to put those minorities in a story. What Atticus is saying here is just like we did when we were reading all of these books and comic books that didn't directly represent us, we stuck our faces on those heroes. We stuck our concepts into their heads so that we could read them from our own perspective. And every individual person reading a novel and reading a book or even watching a movie or even watching a TV show puts their own perspective on those characters. And I love how well encapsulated it is here. And I suppose what I do like even more is, and I suppose one of the things I should definitely call out here is a lot of these scenes are taken directly from the book, directly from Matt Ruff's novel, Lovecraft Country. This conversation here is actually almost word for word a conversation that Atticus has with his father in the book. So this is something that is out there and is being translated onto the TV show. I think some people have thought that this is respecting the work of H.P. Lovecraft, and that's why it's called Lovecraft Country. Matt Ruff was writing his book from exactly the perspective as the TV show is taking its cue. So there is a lot of similarities there with what was actually going on in the book. So I've actually heard, since the show came out, I've heard people going, well, I'm not going to watch that because I don't respect H.P. Lovecraft's opinions and his beliefs. Well, the show is telling you right up front, we don't respect them either. That guy was a racist, but there were concepts in there that we should all take as individuals and run with them as great horror concepts, because we can tell a new story using some of the building blocks that are in there from this evil racist guy.
Absolutely.
Which I think is a really interesting concept, especially in the time of cancel culture, as we've seen. You say one word and there's a lot of cancellation. Get out of the industry you're in. I like the idea of getting rid of the person and taking some of the great concepts they've come up with. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Now, you had a lot of points there, and a lot of them were my points as well. So we're not going to go on a huge amount more about the episode, because I think we've talked a lot about the episode itself, because there's some great stuff going on in here. But for me, one of the things that really stood out, apart from, all of the stuff we discussed about racism and the real horror in the world and the fictional horror there as well, really combining very well in the show. Some of the things I loved about it was that it did feel so different. Some choices were made in how this was filmed that felt like something you wouldn't see on any other TV show. The actual opening of the episode, where we have effectively a horror dream sequence, a nightmare sequence from Atticus while he's asleep on the bus, and it filling up with all of these sci-fi creatures and characters in his almost partially combining with his memories of the Korean War. He's a Korean War veteran, where he's walking through getting shot at.
Yeah.
He's having the voiceover of somebody going, this is an American boy living the American dream of fighting for his country, basically, which is effectively what Atticus thought he was doing by going and joining the army. So that's part of the nightmare. And then it just builds into, you see the tripods from War of the Worlds on one side of the battlefield. You see, Cthulhu himself flying, or him or herself flying over the head of everybody, and you see the UFOs above carrying the Princess of Mars. Like, this is a massive opening for this show
with so many different references as well. Like, we've talked a lot about the literary side. I mean, we've already talked about Bram Stoker, H.P. Lovecraft, Edgar Rice Burroughs. There was Alexandra Dumas as well in here. But, in this as well, it seems like there's H.G. Wells from War of the Worlds, as you say. There's the UFOs. There's so much going on here, and it was just a treat for the eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think behind Atticus, when he's seeing Cthulhu for the first time, I think you see a battle going on between the Warriors of Mars and his army mates, or the army behind him, basically. So another incorporation of the stuff that's going on in his mind. And then again, I also love, that they incorporate a real life hero in here, where we have Jackie Robinson, the baseball player who takes out Cthulhu. I think that's cool, because you kind of have, he's
with his baseball bat as well.
Because it also feels like a bit of a dream or nightmare that you've had in your life, where it's not completely logical to have your hero of the sports field battling your hero or your villain of your pulp piece or your comic books that you read. But I love that this is something that is happening in his head, because it feels totally right, for that inside a dream, Jackie Robinson was the first player to break the baseball color line. He was the first black player to play for any Major League Baseball team when he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers back in 47. So he would be a real life hero of this guy in 1954. It's 7 years later, so really enjoyed just those little touches that were in there, And also, along the drive, rather than the entire show being soundtracked to music of the era, I loved the idea of having the James Baldwin speech being played on the radio. This is a speech, genuinely, I probably only heard it this year, because it was something that was going around on Facebook quite recently. A speech that I just hadn't heard before. It's the same speech that's being used in the show. It's such an inspiring and wonderful speech to have played on the radio as they're going through these cities, just talking about the idea of being a black person in America in these times. It's so relevant and so interesting that they chose that as the soundtrack. It feels like, something new. It feels like something that nobody else would. I think after watching the episode, just an insight of how good I thought this was. After watching the episode, I said to John, why did we put up with 20 years of knowing all of the tropes of horror movies, to the point that horror movies became, now we do a horror movie that's a parody, and now we do a comedy parody of the comedy parody horror movie that we've just seen, because we all know who dies first. It's always the black character. We always know who lives. It's the Virginia white girl. We always know who dies. It's the stoner guy. We all knew these were the tropes of movies. And the reason why they were tropes is because nobody else was given a voice to tell something new.
Exactly.
Whereas this feels like a voice telling something new in the visual medium of TV, and HBO have been so good at that over the last couple of years.
It's really interesting with the James Baldwin sort of talk that he gave on the radio. Because for me, I came to that from a very sort of circumvented way, because as well I read his book Giovanni's Room, which is about an American in Paris who falls in love with an Italian waiter at a Parisian gay bar. So I remember reading that as a teenager, James Baldwin, and then that sort of, when I went down the rabbit hole, as you do as a teenager, where you obsess about something, I kind of went down a rabbit hole of James Baldwin and suddenly realized all these other novels and books that he had done, but also this very, very well-known radio or speech in general that he gave, talking about how, I suppose, the feelings of people who are suppressed, and in particular black people in America. But he even in the speech in the car, it's referencing about why French are in Algeria and Brits in India. It's that so important. And I think for me, it was just, it's this combination that, he very much spoke to me as someone, as a teenager, discussing my own sexuality within my head. So this was just really phenomenally good for me, and like top marks for them picking James Baldwin, because I never thought I would be on a podcast now speaking about that speech that we heard on the radio in there, after I just by chance came across James Baldwin as a teenager and realized that he had written gay fiction and wanted to explore that world, and then realized this whole other world that James Baldwin had been involved in as well. So like it's really just really interesting how things happen, I suppose. But they're like great kind of, I would say, idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's really interesting. I have to read that novel, John. I have to give me that. Haven't given me that one yet.
Well, the bookshelf's just behind us.
Right
Right behind. Fire away.
There's a few books on there that I haven't read just yet. But overall, I think this is a great setup to a season. I think this show is off to such a good start. It's fascinating in how well it's dealing with the mechanics of racism in 1950s America. It's fascinating how it's dealing with the horror of the situations these characters are in, both through man and through supernatural that are in there. I'm really, really loving it. Everything down to the name of the episode being Sundown. And as you're watching the episode, and as we talked about, the horrific thing that we learned from the episode is sundown towns exist and what they are. Well, actually, it's what's even more interesting is they flip that on its head. Sundown is when the true monsters actually come out, or the supernatural monsters come out, and all you've got to do is survive now until sunrise. So, so what was put on the plate for the characters of Atticus, George, and Letitia was, you will only survive if you get out of this town by sundown. And now they're still in the rough area by sundown, and now all they can do to survive is stay alive till sunrise. So, lovely little play there. Lovely.
Yeah, definitely.
John, overall, anything else you want to say about the episode?
No, I think that's all from me. I think I've managed to squeeze everything that I possibly can from that, for sure. Yeah. Yourself?
Nothing else for me. I think, again, I think we've talked about as much as you possibly can between the two of us for this one. Overall, what do you think of the episode, John?
I loved this episode one. I would give it 5 Shoggoths out of 5. It was just... It really captured my imagination and my, I suppose, own sense of inquiry, both, I suppose, from a human point of view, but also with loving the horror. I think there's so much intrigue here. Guy coming back from the Korean War, going back to Chicago to try and understand where his dad has gone, going on this road trip that takes him through the horrors of America for black people, and faced, as you say, with the horrors of the supernatural in the cabin in the woods, and that kind of deep irony of having to survive moving across an imaginary boundary to survive sundown from white people, to then having to survive till sun up or sunrise to survive the supernatural in the cabin in the woods. It was so good. I love all the references going on in this from the books, from the James Baldwin speech. I think, the characters here are just, Letitia is fierce as anything. I really, really like her. She knows her own mind. Mm-hmm. I love George. I love his kind of cool, calm, philosophical nature. And, for me, the standout is certainly when he says, "You need to shoot him now." It is just really nice sort of deadpan play.
I also love Letitia, "Get the hell out of here." Yeah, exactly. She runs out of the diner. Yeah. And I'm driving immediately after.
And Atticus, I just think this is a character that attached to here. I really want to see how Atticus Freeman, I love how he is the smarts. I like how he knows how to survive and to be himself. And I want to see how Atticus Freeman is now embroiled with this fairly Aryan looking lady and butler / gentleman in this huge house in the middle of Ardham County, Massachusetts. And what that means for the Freeman family, his uncle, his childhood friend, and his father, who we've still not seen. So so much intrigue, really interesting, fabulous television. So yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. And admit it, you also want to see Alex without his shirt again.
Oh, well, maybe there could be a little bit of that as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have to say, I love that scene with Letitia when she's watching on and just takes the camera out to take a couple of snaps.
Exactly. You and me, girl.
Hilarious.
Absolutely.
Yes, an excellent episode. I've got nothing more to say about it, but cannot wait to get back to the next episode of Lovecraft Country, Season 1, Episode 2, Whitey's on the Moon, next week.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, fellow Dreadfuls, if you have any feedback you want to give, any thoughts, discussion points, theories on the book by Matt Ruff or on the series, the characters, please send in your thoughts to feedback@tvpodcastindustries.com. You can head on over to our website as well, to tvpodcastindustries.com, and you can leave an audio feedback, 90 seconds of your thoughts. Please just click on the right hand tab and leave your thoughts there, and we will play those back in the feedback section of the podcast. Yep. And of course, we are there on all different forms of social media. You can head on over to our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/TV Podcast Industries, or over on Twitter to TV Pod Industries and join us there. We really hoped you loved this episode of Lovecraft Country as much as we did. And as Derek said, yes, we will be back next week with episode 2, Whitey's on the Moon.
Yeah, we were so quick in recording this episode and so excited about recording this episode. We didn't tell anybody that we were recording it, even our loyal listeners over on TV Podcast Industries. Thanks so much for finding us. We'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Yeah, thank you so much, fellow Dreadfuls, for joining us. It's, as always, a pleasure discussing this fantastic different types of TV with you. Remember, keep watching, keep listening, and importantly on the Dreadful Podcast, keep screaming.
Screaming.
Bye.